it's worth going. This session is about lessons learned from the regional experience implementing PPPs. And the moderator will be Juan Carlos Serrano. He is a World Bank specialist on financial management. We will also have the following panelists: Ricardo Cabello, whom you just heard in the plenary session. He is the consultancy manager of PPP transactions of CFI. Pedro Bojorquez, whom I interviewed yesterday, who is the Accountant General of Colombia. Fiorella Lama, who is the follow-up and monitoring manager of special projects. Of the Central Bank of Ecuador. And Minister of Finance and Economy of Ecuador. I'm sorry. He's the follow-up and monitoring of the special project of the Autonomous Authority of the Mass Transportation Electric System of Lima and Callao in Peru. Sorry, I changed your country. Thank you for not saying anything. Patricia Pela Fernandez, who is with us also. She is the Vice Assistant Manager of the PPP Control and works by taxes of the General Controller of Peru. As you know, public-private partnerships are used in many countries to try to close the gap of infrastructure in terms of roads, hospital, power plants, and other projects. In addition to closing the infrastructure gap, PPPs can also leverage innovation, experience, and the management capacity of the private sector. So this panel is going to debate the regional experience on PPPs in terms of securities, liabilities, contingents, and how we could improve the budget transparency by identifying, quantifying, and disclosing the risks and expected costs. Our moderator, Juan Carlos Serrano, has ample experience in finance, so I am going to give him the floor. With no further ado, so we are going to start our panelists. Juan Carlos, please go ahead. Well, Glenda, I hope you can hear well. Anyhow, the room is not that big. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome everybody to this session. Glenda already made a brief introduction of our panelists. I am very honored to have such a great panel of experts. Before giving the floor to them, she already introduced them, but I would like to ask you a question. Who of you are somehow involved in the implementation of PPPs from any perspective? It can be in the structuring, the control, financial support. Who has a direct link with PPPs in their daily lives? So we have a mixed audience, so I hope you find this presentation interesting. To give you a preamble, I think that we cannot do it without referring to the former sessions that we all attended, where we have already talked widely about topics related to the need to increase investment in infrastructure. I'm sorry, is anybody listening to the English translation? Would you please raise your hand? So, Richard, welcome. Thank you very much. Your presentation should be running. Once again, it is a pleasure to welcome you. Let's see how we survive to the after lunch period. Technology is usually another friend, enemy. Yeah, one screen shows it in Spanish and the other in English, but there is a certain delay. These are lessons based on practice. We are not based on a book. It's something we have lived when working with the governments and trying to implement PPPs. So what I'm going to tell you is I'm going to talk about practical experiences. I have been working on this for 11 years, but I worked in investment banking before, so I'm trying to compile all of the experiences I have had. So these elements also allow us as advisors or consultants to assess the projects before signing the mandates, to support governments, to do our own due diligence, to be able to determine, because you can never guess, but at least to assess if the project in which we are starting has an opportunity to be successful or not. We use these same elements to do our own analysis and other technical issues that I'm not going to talk about here. One of the first things that we pay attention to is previous slide, please. Well, anyhow, let's move forward. So the first topic is the legal institutional framework, something as we discussed this morning. In our civil code countries, we necessarily need a law. Now, this law can be very detailed or it can be based on principles. Based on our experience, we would suggest a law based on principles more than on details. This is fundamental because when you start implementing the transactions, you realize that there could be very particular problems or specific to the country where you are operating, especially if you need to operate with this government contracting law. In some countries, we usually somehow release the structure of the projects and the bidding process of the contracting law because it is created for a different purpose. A contracting law usually is to buy desks or computers. It is not usually made for a PPP project that is built during the bidding process or as a result of the bidding process. So in some sense, it is difficult to work with a public contracting law. So I would suggest that the details should be managed through regulations that can be updated, not necessarily enacting a law. The second important topic is the government team. We talked about this in the morning. It has to be a very well-prepared team because they are going to face another very well-prepared team. And before talking about implementation, we suggest more and more to also consider the implementation phase. That is, once you have selected the winner of the bidding process, what's going to happen the following day? Who's going to supervise the contract? How they're going to do it? Will they have the resources or not to do it? Sometimes we have seen that, for instance, in Colombia, we had some problems in 2007, 2008 when they asked us to build the first road in Colombia through a PPP, and this was a request of the government. We noticed that the budgets to hire the contract supervisors were very low. So what this generated that they had to hire more firms to supervise a very huge project. So there is lack of balance between the supervised and the supervisor is something that we need to think about very careful. They asked us, and we included in the structure of the transaction, that the winner of the bid should have sufficient funds and deposit them in a trust account for the government to be able to subcontract the auditors or supervisors of the contract with funds provided by the project itself. And this has been the practice now, and I think that this is something that we could consider. The second issue is something we mentioned this morning, which is the government commitment. When we come to a project, we are invited by a government and they tell us they want to do a project. One of the crucial issues for us is who is our counterparty? Who is going to ask for this project? Is it the Ministry of Transportation? Okay. Has the Minister of Transportation talked to the Minister of Finance to know if this is a priority project or not? Because sometimes that dialogue doesn't happen, and suddenly the project needs some enhancement, as they call it, from the government, and a contingency project. The Ministry of Finance has to be in agreement. It has to agree with the priority of the project, so there will be no surprises during the approval process. And 6 months later, the Ministry of Finance says this is not a priority project for the country. So we call this in politics the champion. When I started in IFC 11 years ago, they told us that we have to find a champion politician. Now they tell us that we have to identify two, at least the project owner, which is the Ministry of the Sector, and the Ministry of Finance. And if you can identify 3, even better, because it has happened that champions have died. So we signed the mandate, but 3 months later, the champion dies, and then the project dies too. So the issue of the champion is essential. In the most successful projects we have seen is a degree of commitment from the top to the minister and below, because for the project to be a reality. And this is also the length of the project becomes a difficulty. Sometimes this takes 2 years, and we have to keep the champion focused on the project. They get distracted. They have other priorities, and once again, we need to put them back. That if the land is not clear, there is no hospital. If part of the land belongs to another government entity, and we need to have a transfer. All of these issues arise during the due diligence and have to be resolved for the project not to suffer. Clear objectives and reasonable implementation or execution terms. What does this mean? One of the first talks we have with the government is to make sure that we understand what the government really pursues to get with the project, because sometimes you have counteracting goals. You want to increase competitiveness, but finance wants to get more money. So they say charge a front fee to the awardees. Yeah, of course, will increase the cost of their project and the payments for availability. So sometimes among the different government agents, there are contradicting objectives. So that first dialogue is essential for everybody to be aligned as to where the project needs to go. The next topic is a good project, and this is something we discussed in the morning. What has happened sometimes is that ultimately countries learn about this instrument. They say, yes, we want to use it. Let's start. We select the projects, but send the project portfolio, the bad portfolios, have the private sector develop them. And the thing is, the truth is that this happens. No, good projects are kept by the government and the bad ones are sent to the private sector. That's an error. The private sector is the first one to detect when a project is bad. They are experts. And once we had a project for a streetcar, and the government had very high expectations, they thought that they were going to get a lot of money. They wanted to do some part of the project and profitability, but the tram project, the toll with adjustments will pay for the operations. This is not the gold mine that you think. So we made a telephone call with some French experts, and in 3 minutes they told us, okay, how much is how many passengers per day? So many. What is the estimated fee? Such. What is the capex? I say, wait a minute. They calculate that you need a subsidy of so much. In 3 minutes, with 3 pieces of information, we change from profitability to subsidy. So it is not true that the private sector is going to accept any kind of project. There has to be make economic sense. It has to have a business sense. Technical studies is something that has already been repeated, but what does this mean in practice? Why do we need to do so many studies? Because what you don't want is that after awarding the project during its implementation, horribly, there is a forest along the track of the road. This is a true history. You do the engineering design at a scale of 1 to 50,000 and you don't see everything. You take the engineering to 1/5,000 and the scale and these things start appearing. So it's better to know that before or during the bidding period rather than implementation, because that includes the economic balance and who needs more information and so on. The adequate size. Here we are to work on PPPs, but the truth is, and we have to say, that PPPs cannot be used for everything. We are the first ones to say if a project is a candidate for a PPP or not. And one of the things we have determined is the size. Sometimes a government comes and tells us, I want to build a $2 million capex tunnel. The transaction cost would be $500,000, $700,000. So it makes no sense to have a PPP that in theory United has to supervise it for 20 years for just a $2 million capex. So there are certain elements that make a project to be adequate or not for a PPP. The structure of the transaction is also important, and let's move to the end. The processes are important. Especially, I would say, there is a huge difference when a country joins or starts these schemes. They are very used to building public works, but this is a totally different business. Here we are not talking about giving the details or specifications to the constructor to build following certain technical specifications. Here we are talking about a service. Therefore, it's a different approach. As I said this morning, when you start transferring the risks, the universe of participants starts becoming smaller, and at the end, very few stayed. Only those that are experts on this kind of business rather than the builders. Builders can be an important element, but not necessarily the one that will push the project forward. Pre-qualification requirements. Of course, we want to protect the government to find the best possible partner, but we also have to be careful to set up pre-qualification requirements that do not affect the competition during the bidding process. What has happened is maybe I want to giving this airport in concession with 1 million passengers a year. So pre-qualification experience in managing airports with at least 10 million passengers a year. Why do you are asking for 10 million if you only have 1 million? But in 10 years, the airport will grow 5 million. So why ask for 10 million? Because ultimately, this is restrictive when generating competition. Efficient and transparent the bidding process. This sounds like a little discretion. Yes, it has to be transparent. Yes, it has to be efficient. But the horror stories are projects that during the bidding process start to be changed. The engineering study was not completed as deep as it was required when the bidding process started, so we start adding studies to the database, and the project profile starts changing. This is a horror story for the private offerers. I was saying that our average of structuring is about 2 years. We have horror stories of 7 years. 3 governments, we just completed one. 7 years, 3 different administrations to be able to, with a project, the profile constantly changed. They didn't like this, they don't want that, but it has a cost for the private sector. In due diligence, the private sector spends between $1 million to $2 million just to submit an offer. And I think that we have to take this into account to be able to attract investment. Finally, funding, which we discussed this morning, and supervision, which I don't get tired of repeating. The best result of a bidding process can fail to work because of a poor supervision. A colleague of mine that has experience in supervision once told me, and they invited me to come to a Central American country and said, we just selected such sponsor. How are they? And I called my friend who had experience in regulation. I said, how about this gentleman? And he said, everything depends on how you regulate him. If you are relaxed, then he will not do his job. But if you are well organized, he will do the job. But it will depend on how you supervise this person. And this beginning on day one, you have to say, this is my contract, this is the way we are going to work, and the person is going to align it. You give them the chance, then negative consequences will arise. Thank you very much, Richard. I think that you have really given us very specific ideas, complemented what you talked or presented this morning. We want to follow the cycle of our life cycle of our project. So in this sense, I now would like to give the floor over to my colleague and panelist, Fiorella de Lama. She's going to be talking about how, or based on her specialization, which is risk follow-up and monitoring. Let's hope that technology works better now. Before anything else, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to come to tell you a little bit about our experience in the implementation of metro projects through the application of PPPs. To give you a little bit of context, we are developing the metro projects on the base of a basic network that is considered 6 metro lines. We have developed line 1 already, which is in full operation, line 2, which is in the execution process, and lines 3 and 4 are right now under the feasibility studies. The autonomous authority has also been developing the master plan for the integrated transportation system with a 2050 horizon so that we can give to the City of Lima an integrated and coherent system according to its needs and the demand that the system requires. So how have we developed our metro projects? Line 1, as I told you, is in operation. This was a public work which was developed after a unit price offer, and the operation and maintenance was given in concession through a PPP. In the case of Line 2, the studies were contracted by pro-investment, and it was developed as a comprehensive PPP in which we gave to the concessionaire the design, funding, construction, operation, and maintenance. This contest was carried out by Proinversión. The concessionaire is the Ministry of Transportation, and the transportation program is in charge of the monitoring. The granting authority is the autonomous, and we have a concession for Citran that also has a supervising entity. Lines 3 and 4 were thought and were scheduled as an integral PPP following the same model as Line 2. However, although these projects were contracted initially by Proinversión, at the end of last year, the contraction was given to ATE. Why? Not because we are against the PPPs, but because we believe that we have to do a comprehensive assessment of the projects to assess possible optimizations that can be made, which would allow us to define an adequate structure for the project and define also the most adequate model for its management and implementation. As we have been hearing during these presentations, there are different models to implement projects. In our case, we have applied two models, the public work for Line 1 and comprehensive PPP for Line 2. Nevertheless, a key aspect for the development of transportation projects, in our case, the metro projects, is the implementation and management scheme. These projects, because of their nature, are very complex, very sophisticated, and require a high level of detail. And they require articulation and technical support on an ongoing basis. They are developed in a city that is already consolidated. Therefore, there have to be optimizations or improvements during its development. There is no perfect recipe. There is no recipe in which that we can copy. So what we have done is to assess the lessons learned from our international parties, first at a regional level and also globally. And we have seen that since the public work that can be built with a different number of projects and integrated to a comprehensive PPP, each of these cities develops a management model according to its needs and customized to set needs. So I think it is important for us to assess, and according to the characteristics of our cities and projects, to be able to define the model, the structuring model that is most adequate. Line 2, which is the comprehensive PPP, is a 35-kilometer project. 27 correspond to Line 2 specifically, and 8 kilometers are shared with Line 4. This is a development of our underground project with an automated go-4 system without driver, which runs and benefits 13 districts of Lima City, going to transport 1.2 million passengers, and it's going to reduce in 90 minutes the commuting time. As general considerations of this project, the concession contract was signed on April 28, 2014. As we said, this is a public-private partnership under the co-finance concession. The concessionaire is Metro de Línea 2, which is constituted by 6 companies from Peru, Spain, and Italy. And we also have a regulator supervisor, which is Susitran, that has a supervising consortium constituted by the Chinese, Korean, and Peruvian companies. The current contract has two addendums, one that was signed in December 2014 and the other one on December 13, 2018. The concession is for 35 years. Here, it is important to stress the complexity of this project given the diversity of stakeholders that participate, which sometimes make the development and progress of the project very complex. For the case of Addendum 2, for instance, it took us almost 2 years to reach an agreement, and we have not included all of the topics that were pending. We just included some that could give new energy to the project to move forward. During the development of this project structuring, it is very important to know the conditions, the concurrent conditions to start the project, to do an adequate evaluation that allows us to know the process to establish appropriate timelines for the execution of the project. This is to alert any kinds of deviations or delays that could cause to be able to take the actions to correct that deviation and continue without it impacting the schedule that has been agreed on. Also, it is very important to have an adequate control, management, and transparency of the information, which has to be properly backed and supported and has to be unified and well documented. It has to be of public access. For this purpose, what we have done in the Autonomous Authority is a monitoring system open for the public, which can be accessed through any mobile phone. This is the address, and using this system we can see the concurrent conditions for the beginning of the project execution. So far we have developed a module program for the beginning of the works. We can notice if we have complied, if we have a delivery per areas, we have the deadline. It is supported by the corresponding menus. We have the municipal authorities, which is a responsibility of the concessionaire. If the concessionaire has complied, having the approved engineering studies. So this tool allows us to show citizens how the project is progressing, and it allows us to have the information unified, which is very important for the development of these kind of projects, as I said, because of the complexity of the information that is managed. Here it is very important to reiterate that it is necessary for the technical team, in charge of the control and monitoring on behalf of the state, to be strong. Institutional strengthening is a key factor in the development of these kinds of projects, because we have to be at the same level. We have to be as sound as our private counterparty. And in this way, we will be able to develop truly adequate projects. This is the experience that we have. Thank you very much, Fiorella. Very interesting your presentation. We have seen a more specific case in the Metro of Lima, which is a city that we know that has a lot of traffic and mobility problems. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Patrice Apela, who works in the General Controller's Office of the Republic of Peru. Hello, good afternoon. Hopefully, we are fulfilling the challenge of keeping you awake and entertained after lunch. I cannot stand because there is very little space here. I like your presentation really because it really woke me up. Very briefly, it is impossible not to repeat what we have been listening this whole morning. Those of us who are in this world of the PPPs or private investment, whether in Central America, Mexico, or some country in South America, we will always have a common denominator, which is how much have we progressed, where are we in the spectrum of attracting foreign investment, and how can we move forward. I have been manager for many years, and now I'm on the side of control, so you can imagine that it is very complex. And my chip is always going to be as manager, so when I analyze the auditors that are in charge of the team that report to me, and they analyze a PPP, which is a challenge that we have today. So we start thinking, okay, what does a manager need to make decisions? They need room to act, flexibility without the law becoming working against them or a barrier. So I would like to talk about this, to talk about some lessons learned. Sounds because the suggestion of PPPs and the controller of Peru, it has been around for only 1 year, so I will tell you a little bit what the challenge is. But I will finish by telling you about some lessons learned. But today is a little bit premature, but we have already seen what the outliers in the huge execution projects. The first 3 lessons or takeaways, and this that I have here, that Fiorella we have made and we have worked very frequently. There is something that is undoubtful. The first thing that we need to have is trust. If there is no trust among the partners, the project will never advance, never. It's not yours and mine, so I penalize when you don't comply, because the state is never penalized. Fines are for the private sector, for the investor. The government sometimes self-penalizes when they stop, when they don't identify the beginning of a conflict, or when they enter into arbitration. So that's number 1, trust. Number 2, Richard mentioned, in the chair of the main panel mentioned it, we need to level the field among the investor and the government. For no one is a secret. I always talk about Chile and also Colombia. Colombia learned from us. They were many missions visiting to Peru, and they said Peru has a wonderful legal framework, and they copied in Colombia, but then they have exceeded because of institutionality and governance, because they have really started generating loyal figures. It's not that easy, but not that difficult either. So unless we have a level playing field among the partners, we will never work in a reasonable manner, because there will be differences, not just from a technical point of view, but also from a structural point of view, as to how I can sit at a table and impose my technical or legal opinion, my economic criterion, not because I'm the state, I have a use imperium, but because I am aware of it and I know better than you who are sitting across from me. So that is the huge difference. The state, and it's not the topic of this panel, but the government and our governments, our countries, the ones that use PPPs know the mechanisms. Can be a PMO. I hire a transaction contract, or I go to IFC and tell them, and knock on the door and tell them, please help me, please give me support. There are many different mechanisms. We didn't invent the wheel yesterday. Many countries have done it, and actually Chile has institutionalized it. The third point, which is nothing that nobody knows, is we have a lack of trust on the PPP mechanism. There is a general disappointment created, as Veronica Zavala said this morning, definitely the political circumstances of the region today. And then you look at the simple figures, because we work with figures every day, so I'm not going to talk about that. But how much does it take a PPP to come to an end? 18, 20, 24, 32, 40 months. Some take 4 or 5 years, and they are still in the pipeline. So how long does it take to be complete? Versus the return that the private get from that project, or the political advantage that could be given for a certain period of government. So you sum up very quickly, and this doesn't match. There is no good results. So this brings to the lack of credit of PPPs. If I've had a public work, it's very easy because I don't have bundling. I just have the construction service, or it's maintained by the government and maybe for 2 years by the private, but this person builds, the company builds, and they leave the business. But as a government, I keep the problem. So we have not yet found that trade-off that at some point made us to have a peak of private investment in the region. I'm talking about the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, especially countries that have been using PPPs the longest. So how can we go back there? How can we leap over that disappointment, circumstantial disappointment that is giving us many lessons? If I go to the controller's office, the controller Nation Shark, to whom I am going to be representing tomorrow, we are going to be talking about governance in this other panel tomorrow. What the controller did was he had a challenge. He dreamed about it, took it to Congress. It was approved, and today we have an area specialized in Peru's controller's office that oversees all of the PPPs in the country, and in all of its different versions: the prior control, the concurrent control, and after control. I have that responsibility on my shoulders, but I really don't think about it too much because I get stressed. So in a good way, what have we learned, and what do we still and what are we still afraid of? In the Peruvian regulation, we have something very particular, which I'm sure no other regulation in the country has. In Peru, some 3 years ago, created a public policy to promote private investment, and along this line, created a system. And in the morning, they talked about functional systems. It is important to have functional program systems in our countries and governments. Why? Because the systems bring a network of stakeholders. They order the policy, they bring principles, procedures, and the only thing is that we put together a structure. So what the PPP law brought, it has set the controller as one of the stakeholders in this system for the first time. So of course, the governments and everybody looks at them and say, what is the controller's office doing here? Well, yes, it is necessary, and we are there. So what do we aspire to become? That stakeholder that is not fearful or intimidating, but that adds value to the process to create public policy and to use their government resources well. How are we going to do it? By being flexible. It's the only way we can do it. When we do the prior controls and the concurrent controls, we have to make sure that they get stakeholders we work with get to know to us, the PP unit, which in Peru is called Proinversión. Many of the actors that have projects or programs in their pipeline, they need to know exactly what it is that we pay attention to, why, and what are the risks that usually our reports point to. It is easier to say, and in a year we have still fine-tuning it and planting seeds to be able to get this goal. But there are many entities that knock on our door, and of course we have an open door policy at the controller's office. This is the first thing that we have been breaking down. The entity that works inward, no, we work outwards. It's just, we are just another stakeholder. So what are we doing? We have engaged in a very serious dialogue with a multilateral organism to standardize and systematize all of our opinions. And not just that, but we are going to publish them. That is, any public entity from at any level of the national or subnational government that wants to promote a project that once has to go through the controller's office because it's mandated by law. We say it's a water project, okay? The controller is going to look at the risk of demand. If it is a metro project, so the controller office is going to pay attention to the co-funding level and the competition conditions. Well, if it is an irrigation project with an ecological risk, so the controller's office is going to pay attention. These are, of course, hypothetical examples. But controller's office will make sure that the risks are not allocated once it has been sent. The last example, I have a project that is an unrequested initiative that was around as part of the portfolio. It's being reformulated, and it's going to bring back out. The controller is going to make sure that during this time it has not generated a transformation, as Richard said, of the business model, that no substantial changes to the technical offer have been made, and consequently that there are no aggressive offers, that in our countries they are frequent. So this is basically what we expect to get. As a lesson learned, I just want to mention a couple of things more, which is applicable to all PPP projects, or work per task, which is another work. And the state should not be committed beyond what it can achieve, because the moment they write it down, they are condemned, so that when there is a default of 1, 2, or 3 days beyond renegotiating the timeline, there is overhead that we are incurring in, and this is an incubator for conflicts that could arise between the parties to the concession. So this is basically what I wanted to share with you, and I believe that trust, consider each other as partners, and retake the track that we had in the past. And while countries that are more advanced, that have more tradition, can understand their beginning and go back and look at Costa Rica, Panama, Uruguay, and the emerging countries and PPPs that are already being noticed in the region, just look at them and say, yes, we have a lot to learn from them. We cannot just think about our successes and advances. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it has been useful. Thank you, Patricia. Very interesting to listen about this change in the conception of the role that the controller is expecting to achieve. I think this is where many of the superior supervised entities should be focusing now in the round of presentation, but not least important, I will give the floor over to Mr. Pedro Horker, Accountant General of Colombia, who is going to give us a presentation about financial reports and accounting presentations for PPPs. Welcome, Pedro. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to share with Richard Fiorella and Patricia this panel for today's agenda. In fact, Colombia, during the 90s and during this decade of the 21st century, we have been engaged in the exercise of public-private partnerships. And because of constitution reasons, as accounting authority of Colombia, which is also, we have created the figure of the accountant general in our country based on the convergent processes of leading accounting practices at the international level, which is basically two packets of standards: the international financial reporting standards and the international public accountant standards. When we talk about is that IFRS adapted to the public sector, especially with CNIF 12 that impacts accounting regulations. So in fact, Colombia, in its development of public-private partnerships through our territory, about 1.3 million square kilometers plus, which is the continental land, has migrated through time to what is called in some countries the concession generations. We are in the fourth generation. From the first, second, and third generation, what we have learned is what has been mentioned here, the deficiency of the structures, as Richard mentioned, which is the first exercise, which is the structuring of contractual document in the bilaterality that corresponds to is a concessionaire and the recipient or the actor that ultimately represents the state when efforts are joined in a social policy. So when we talk about concessions in our case, we look at all of the works that you see on this slide: ports, airports, public utilities, health services, education. So when we also look at the concession agreements between the concessionaire and the granting entity and the implications that this has, the concessionaire, the category is the exploitation of the assets or one asset with a right that gives them this contractual relation, a bilateral relation, in the framework of a topic that has been mentioned here. That concession has to begin with a fundamental principle, which is the legitimate trust that should exist among the parties. Because when there is legitimate trust is not there since the beginning during the contracting, drafting, there are risks. Risks are very important, and in the concession schemes, we have to see that the issue of the risk management in the first generation, second in Colombia until the decade of the 90s of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century, there is a concession from the center of the country to the Atlantic coast that was called the Highway of the Sun. And this suffered many different problems with the operator, the concessionaire, and it was never built, which is called the COMSA case, in which the government of Colombia had to intervene, even with the government of Spain, to close the difference because of the poor structuring of the project. That was one of the projects that would cross the country and that created a very important infrastructure. So when we talk about recognition and measurement of the assets that are given in concession, there are cases in which the asset is given by the concessionaire for a better rehabilitation of the assets. So this is where we have two effects: the effect of the initial measurement and the effect of the final measurement. In the ISP, we talk about the fair value and the understanding that taking reference for a reasonable value, it's very hard. Because, for instance, when you build a road in sectors that are basically flat, the risk is different in the case of our topography because of the high mountains. If you have heard about Colombia, life in the front border together with Venezuela because of the topography of the land. So at a certain point in time, they will affect the revenue of the granting entity or the contract balance, because last week the construction of the road came to a standstill for 8 days, and that affects everybody. In the convergence project, we didn't have direct convergence, we only have indirected, and this, by gathering the experience of Chile and gathering the experiences of Peru together with the World Bank in an agreement that we had, we structured a model for accounting regulation that is on our page www.contaduria.gov.co, which is harmonized with the reality of the Colombian state to apply it to the granting entity and the operator, to be applied by both of them, and the concessionaire as well. Why? Because looking at the problems that have taken place, we decided to come up with a regulation for the 4Gs in the case of Colombia that were completed in the prior administration. And in Colombia, we use a figure to financially leverage the projects for infrastructure development, which is something that has been around since the beginning of the project, that is managed with a budget figure that is called the future effectiveness for our 16 projects that are today, which are about 48 billion pesos, $48 million, which is under execution right now. Some of these projects are the financial closing to begin operations. So here we have a topic in the post-measurement when we receive the asset that for our case, we don't take the fair value. It is in the ISP 32, but we take the cost and the amortizations accumulated, plus something else that we added as a result of the analysis that we did with the Standard Council. And we decided to apply deterioration on some of the elements for the development on each project. This recognition and measurement of the PPPs from the point of view of the concessionaire and the granting entity is generated because of the category of the contract. For both. In Colombia, we have these three situations that I am showing. When the granting entity has the unconditional obligation to pay to the concessionaire in cash or with another financial asset for the asset that has under concession, this is when we take it and we give a contribution of the government with the budget flow to begin the project. And as the works progress, we give them what they need to move on. This case generates a financial liability for the state as the government moves forward, and it generates a deferred liability when the grantee gives to the concessionaire the rights to exploit the asset in the case of roads and in the case of airports. In the case of airport infrastructure, we have a department that manages the civil aviation, which collects the airport taxes, and with this they pay to the concessionaire the values that are agreed at a certain point, and they generate financial liabilities and deferred liabilities that are recorded in the accounting books according to the modality that was agreed on. The recognition of expenses is done the same way because of the exploitation of the assets under concession, or in the proportion to which we are entitled, either to affect the accounts receivable or, on the other hand, the accounts payable automatically. The guarantees of the inflows probability for the enforce this collateral will depend on the accounting effects that are recorded in the model that is being used. So according to the typology of the contract, we generate a contingency liability or provision at a certain point in time. For instance, in the road concessions and airport concessions, we generate a contingent asset at the time the projected income value doesn't happen. So the state has to start recording, and we manage this in order account. So when this becomes a reality, we incorporate it. So finally, when the probability, we set provisions for that purpose. Both the deferred liability and their income and the liabilities that are recorded as contingent are reflected on the side of the asset and on the side of the liability with the effects that it has on the income statement according to the IASP 32. And this is, I'm going to take 2 additional minutes in the understanding that, for instance, the effects of the first concessions, the 1G and the 2G and part of the 3G, have not yet been liquidated or paid off because of the segregation of the typology of the contracts. Because the entity, the concessionaire, when they give an asset to the government, they say, here it is, but they have not broken down or de-articulated for depreciation purposes or deterioration purposes or for purposes of a higher value when they make enhancements or additions to a concession. So this is the case of the main authorities, that the National Infrastructure Agency, which contracts the whole scheme of the concessions without the prejudice that when the concession ends and the authorities receive back the assets, in the case of whether it's a road or an airport, to the corresponding authority, so the fiscal control entity will play an important role as it happens in Peru. This is a very important topic that today the current controller has paid attention because of the lessons that we have been getting from the first, second, and third generation. The construction of the accounting model that we just finished, I recognize publicly that it was a big effort, and we worked together with Chile and Peru, but together with also the IBM, to come up with these regulations. And this has been the main challenges in the application of the regulation and the strategies, the limitations, the additional measurement of the assets under concession. This has been an issue for the application of the standard, the recognition of the guarantees of the cash flows, which has to do with the recognition of the deterioration of public use assets that have under concession, because in the first way, the first contracts were structured. And the last thing we have determined is that for Invías, which is in charge of the first two generations of PPPs, when we incorporated them to the standard, it has not been easy. We are just incorporated with the current standard the fourth generation projects, and the first, second, and third generations, we gave them time to start applying the standard because they have to pay it according to the accounting regime in terms of public accountant as it used to be, and determining a very important topic which is part of an international accounting standard, which is the deterioration or depreciation of components, which is a very important issue that we have regulated, which is not part of the IPSAS, but with the 26 adjustment was included. And the other thing is the useful life, the topic of the useful life. In our case, for the useful life, we had to agree with the authority that manages the concessions to determine the useful life of each of the projects and the difficulties that this is bringing about. This is very quickly in our page. You can find anything and everything that you might like to see about public-private partnerships in the case of our country. And in Colombia, we have a saying, if you are the one that is interested, ultimately are the partners of a large company that is called a country. The partners in our case are 45.5 million Colombians, and this is public information, because when this is public, then you prevent the corruption in our country. Colombia has not been exempt from the Odebrecht case that has from the top of Latin America, and it's affecting every country. Today, we are submitting a bill of law at Congress so that the entities that act as concessionaires and incur into corruption and anti-ethical acts can lose their resources of have invested in a concession because of corruption. This is a very important issue in Colombia. Right now, some high-level officers of the government, of the Colombian government, are in jail because of the corruption in terms of PPPs. This is a public debate throughout Latin America. In fact, this is the panorama that I would give to many hours, but time doesn't give us enough time. I think this is also an important perspective. It's very important. As I said, these are topics that are necessarily discussed in the plenaries. As I warned you, time is our enemy, and the fact is that we are against time and changing the dynamic. I would like to briefly open to you, our audience, if you have any questions that you might ask of our panelists. I think this is has more rooms. I think if we could do it without a microphone, if you please raise your hands. No, we do need a microphone. And please say who you are addressing the question to. My question is for Mr. Richard Cabello. I am interested in terms of supervision of the PPPs, especially in terms of cost of funding of this role that is very relevant. I agree with that everything you've mentioned, in the sense that definitely the state has to have a very strong counterparty to be able to be a good counterparty, and that the signals that have to be mentioned have to be around since the first day to be able to be empowered and fulfill its role properly. But there is an issue of resources, definitely. From your experience, in percentage topics, in percentage, what has been the percentage that has been devoted to supervision? Here in Costa Rica, supervision has been around between 1% and 3%, and this is really, in my opinion, a very low percentage, which really does not give sufficient resources to the state to do a better job. Can you give me an idea? The truth is we don't have a specific percentage because it depends on the complexity of the project. In the case of roads in Colombia, this has become a practice, but even in the case of roads, it depends if the road has tunnels, bridges, or other structures. So the complexity will vary, and therefore the supervision costs will also vary. What we have done in this case is to use experts in supervision. So what are the terms of reference to do the supervision in the construction and operation phases? Second, what is the kind of supervisor that we want? At what level of supervisor do we want to get? Because we have those that have a lot of experience but are very expensive. We have some others that are intermediate and others that are more limited. And third, I would say engage in a dialogue with the market of supervisors. Once you have clearly understood what it is that you want to do, what are the qualification criteria that you want to come up with, then open a dialogue with the market to see what is the most adequate budget before launching the contest. I think you have to not be afraid to engage in a dialogue with the market when the transaction is not even part of a bid. But it's important to get their feedback because the bidding process opens. Another suggestion: when you set up the pre-qualification criteria, try to keep them. Because it has also happened that you set some very demanding criteria because you are really interested in having top-ranking supervisors, and then the market starts reacting, and the locals start complaining, saying that this is too much, they are asking for investment on equipment that we don't have, and so on and so forth. And then the government starts doubting and starts decreasing the quotation, and you get the worst of the worlds with a high budget, low criteria. So you have to really be strong to withstand those temptations. Thank you, Richard. I think Patricia also wants to complement this idea. Yes, I'm going to say something. Two flavors of supervision in the country. The first flavor is the one that is financed by the private entity. The awardee and then becomes a concessionaire or investor. they commit since day one of the contract to cover the supervision fee. Usually in Peru, the supervision fee for regulated sectors, which are transportation, water, energy, and telecommunications, is set by the law. And this is a fee that is between 1% and 3%. Now, not all of the regulators are the same. The most powerful one in the country, in Peru, is the transportation regulator. This is the one that is in charge of airports, ports, railroads, etc. So the complexity of the projects and the subsector will depend on how broad and rigorous should be the level of supervision. Now we have a different flavor. The flavor of the unregulated sectors, I assume that they also exist here in Costa Rica, usually the social sectors, solid waste, education, hospitals, and large irrigation projects in Peru, which have been case studies worldwide. Chavimoch, Colmamaje, Siwas, and others, which are huge dams, are not regulated either by an independent organism. So what happens there? It is the granting entity or the government that has to cover the supervision fee, and this is where I am aligned with Richard. The terms of reference have to be clear, but also, although they have to be clear, the supervisor should not be the head of the one that hires him. They shouldn't know more. In other words, if they are hired because they know more, the one that hires them has to have the same, at least the same technical knowledge, because otherwise incentives become more complex. That is an issue of supervision. That's key. And this is where the first failures to comply start happening. Thank you very much. Another question? Good afternoon. I am Heriberto from Brazil. I apologize for my Spanish. My question is for Pedro. In Brazil, there is a great deal of concern because of the PPP impact on the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And I am an accountant, and I say that there are financial liabilities. The managers are worried, especially governments, subnational governments. Do you have the same problems in Colombia with this? Well, in fact, the issue of liabilities, deferred liabilities in particular, was hotly debated in Colombia, especially with the leverage of their origin, and because of the payments to the concessionaire implications have. For instance, in the case of vías, it is the contract says that the car flow, vehicular flow, has to be of a specific number. But what happens is that there are times in which this calculation could have been undervalued. The calculation of traffic, of cars, could be lower. So what happens is that the state is committed to pay the differential in use for that road that is under concession. So this automatically creates a liability, a financial liability, that as the income is received and payments to the concessionaire are made, the government has to foresee to have the resources to pay to the concessionaire. So automatically this creates a financial liability. This was hotly debated in our country because of the implications it has on the budgets of these public entities. So from an accounting point of view, in the first regulation, we managed it as a memorandum accounts, reference accounts, or order accounts. But knowing that it is a reality, automatically the government is in the obligation of recognizing that financial liability, but the effects of the costs at a certain time can happen. And there are cases of concession in which these terms were not agreed, and right now they are in a courts debating this, and you know that the decisions of the judicial body doesn't take months, it takes years. And even today on this issue of the financial liability, the costs have increased because of the effects that since the concessions are contracted, the arbitration courts and tribunals, this is an quicker way to solve a conflict that can happen, and this is the way we have agreed there. So in the case of financial liabilities, they happen in these scenarios. But in the case of the first, second, and third generation, we are still under liquidation. So this is why it's so important to have a financial liability and a deferred liability in the terms to which they are related, both for the concession, the granting entity, and the operator. And this is how we manage this. Thank you very much. I think there are no more time other than to close this session. On my behalf, thank you for your commitment and your attention. I think it has been an open dialogue and a closer. I would like to thank you, Richard, Patricia, and Fiorella, and Pedro, for your excellent contribution and ideas. And let's give them a round of applause.